I carried faith in routine like a house key I never questioned. Garlic on the stove, 2 plates, the pipes singing their thin metal song. But the night I stood in the rain with a bouquet wilting in my hands, I felt the ground shift. The clock glowed 8:08. The house fell silent, and I finally understood what it had been whispering all along. I used to believe marriage was simple. I carried that belief the way you carry a house key in your pocket without ever checking if the door has changed. Our routines felt like proof that the lock still fit and the hinge still held. That quiet proof tasted like garlic and rosemary in the air when she texted me that she had left the office. I put water to boil and set the pan to warm. I listened for the old pipes to sing their thin metal song and told myself that ordinary life was a kind of prayer that always got answered. All we had to do was keep saying it, keep stirring, keep showing up at the table. It was not perfect and nothing is. I never chased perfect because I grew up in a house where perfect meant you were 1 minute away from yelling. I learned early that simple beats perfect most days. A small house that smells like food beats a big one that smells like silence. I stood by that creed through good paychecks and bad tires, through flu seasons and late flights, through the kind of tired that sinks into your bones like cold rain. I thought that meant we were safe. I equated endurance with immunity. I mistook habit for trust. I considered trust a machine you could leave running in the basement without ever lifting the hatch to check the gears. Then she started working late. At first I let it pass like a cloud that drifts across the yard and does not bother the grill. But working late arrived more often than the mail. I thought everyone gets busy. I thought the quarter must be closing. I thought managers love meetings with bread baskets. Later she stopped coming home hungry. Her laughter changed shape and it had a new edge, like a glass with a chip you only feel when it touches your lip. She wore a perfume I did not buy. I tried to make a joke about it, and the joke slipped on the tile and cracked. I swept it up and told myself jokes are fragile and marriages are not. I kept cooking anyway. I set 2 plates and waited. The house tasted of rosemary without her. The chair across from me sat there like a judge without a face. The clock over the stove grew louder, the second hand clicking like a cricket trapped in a jar. The food cooled, the oil filmed, and a small idea knocked on the back door of my mind. I did not open it. I said come back during business hours. The idea left footprints in flour on the counter that I wiped away with the heel of my hand. Friday arrived with the patience of a debt collector. She said dinner with clients at 8. I thought I would be the kind of husband who makes a gesture. I pictured the grin she used to give me when I surprised her with cheap flowers and a stubborn smile. I drove to the restaurant with a bouquet that looked brave in the passenger seat. I told myself that romance survives if you feed it. Parked, I walked in. The room felt like a warm stage and the air was full of forks and good news. I saw tables of people who were not my people. I did not see her, not even the shadow she leaves when she stands up too fast from a chair. My phone lit with a text. Already inside, running late. I smiled with the mouth of a man who wants to be wrong about the ache behind his ribs. I waited. 10 minutes turned into 20. 20 put on a heavier coat and turned into an hour. I asked a host who had mastered the art of sympathy and choreography if there was a reservation under her name. He gave me the face people give a lost tourist at the wrong landmark. He said no. Not tonight, not on the books. The bouquet lost a little color. The room lost a little oxygen, and I stepped outside to find some. Rain stitched the parking lot into one gray sheet. I stood under it because sometimes you need the sky to rinse the story you are telling yourself. A car pulled in. Another left, the lights dragging over me. I told myself this is a misunderstanding that will make a decent story someday. Then the kind of moment you never plan for arrived without ceremony. A pair of headlights slowed. The interior light popped like a small star. There she was. She was in another car, laughing with a man who had the posture of someone used to being agreed with. They leaned close, not the way old friends lean, not the way colleagues lean. They touched hands like people who have stopped measuring distance. I did not make a scene because scenes are for people who need an audience, and I have never loved applause. I held the bouquet. The stems felt like a handful of wet pencils. I watched my life rearrange itself without asking permission. I watched the rain turn the pavement into a mirror that showed me a version of myself I did not recognize. Something small in me fell quiet, like a dog that hears a storm before the thunder and waits under the table without moving. I got in my car. I did not start it. I put the bouquet on the seat and it fell, petals kissing a puddle on the floor mat. I laughed once without sound because dry humor survives almost everything. The clock on the dashboard said 8:08. That number has followed me since I was a kid who found a coin that always landed on its edge when I told a lie. That coin still sits in my junk drawer and flips itself when the house does not want to speak. I have seen it standing like a tiny guard more than once after a hard conversation. I thought about that coin now. I thought about numbers that repeat when the world wants to nudge you without leaving fingerprints. I drove home. The wipers said a steady prayer across the glass. I parked and went inside. The kitchen smelled like the dinner I had not eaten. I set her plate beside mine, the way a man keeps faith with a ritual even after the god has left the building. I sat and I listened to the silence, because sometimes silence is the only honest witness. My phone buzzed. The message said dinner is running late. Do not wait up. I stared at the words and saw the space between them, and that space held the shape of a truth I did not want to name. I did not confront her. The urge to charge the hill is strong, but it is also messy. I have seen too many battles fought on the wrong hill by the right people. I prefer patience when the ground is soft. I prefer a quiet ledger when the numbers begin to quarrel. I sat with 2 empty plates and a room that remembered better nights. I felt the air around me change, not like a hurricane but like a barometer that drops a fraction and tells you to find your coat, your boots, your good sense. The hardest part was not the lie. Lies are like discount store umbrellas that turn inside out the first time the wind has an opinion. The hardest part was not even the perfume that did not belong to our house, or the laughter that had moved its mailing address. The hardest part was the simple arithmetic of my domestic life. It added up cleanly, and then someone started borrowing numbers. I could see the totals still printed on my table. I could feel the absence like a ring that leaves a pale band on a finger after it is removed. That is when I understood the truth that does not send flowers, does not leave a note, does not apologize when it wakes you at 3 in the morning. That was the night I stopped waiting. It was also the night something old woke up in me. It did not feel angry. It did not feel broken. It felt like the steady hand you need to hold a blade to the whetstone. It felt like the flicker in the corner of your eye when a pattern starts to show itself on the fabric, and you realize the fabric has been talking the whole time. Finally, you decide to listen. The next morning carried the soft hangover of a storm. The light came in pale and undecided. I brewed coffee the way I always did and watched the steam climb like a thin ghost that had not yet chosen a room. I set 2 mugs on the counter out of muscle memory and put one back in the cabinet, because memory does not pay rent and I prefer tenants who bring something to the table. The house answered with its usual whispers in the vents. I told myself I would take inventory with the patience of a shopkeeper who just learned the register has been short for a while, and who knows the numbers will tell the story even if the people do not. I started with the visible world because the visible world is the one that plays fair. The sink still wore a lipstick half-smile on the rim of a glass from the night before, and that color did not belong to any story I was part of. A receipt lived in the trash with a timestamp that slid past 9, and the restaurant name did not match the one where I had stood with a bouquet and rain in my hair. I let my hands move without hurry. I collected what the house had kept, and it surprised me like a quiet witness who suddenly clears a throat and asks to be sworn in. I kept the items like a curator who knows the exhibit will change a mind if arranged in the right light. There was a scarf that did not match the season in the hall closet. A pair of earrings that had never kissed her ears. A tiny hotel shampoo bottle that hid behind our own as if it had been taught to keep its head down. There was the faint suggestion of cologne that tasted like cedar and ambition. I arranged these pieces on the kitchen table, and they made a map that did not use roads. I could trace the routes with my finger and feel the small hum that comes when alignment starts to happen beneath the surface of things. I said all right to nobody in particular, and it felt like the right word. The coin in the junk drawer decided to be helpful. I did not ask for that and I did not need theater. Yet when I pulled the drawer, It stood upright between a measuring tape and a rusted house key. It swayed without falling. I watched it with the same attention you give to a candle in a church when you do not belong to the church but you respect the light. I touched it and it rolled and then stood again. The air in the kitchen tightened just enough to make me blink. I told the empty room that a man can hold two truths at the same time, and sometimes the second one kicks the first one out of bed. I went to work that day and pretended to be the same man. My coworkers told the same stories. The phones rang with the same complaints. I nodded where nods belonged and signed where signatures were needed. Every time I looked at the clock, I saw the same little arrangement of numbers I did not expect. It happened at 8:08 in the morning, and again at 8 minutes after noon, and again at 8 after 2. I am not a numerology man by nature, and I know a brain loves patterns the way a gambler loves near misses. Still, I felt the nudge behind the ribs that told me to pay attention. At lunch, I walked around the block. The city wore its usual mask of efficiency, and the drizzle left thin freckles on my sleeves. I passed a pawn shop that had been there for years without ever speaking to me, and today it spoke. By spoke, I mean the door stood open, and a small fan pushed the smell of old metal and old stories onto the sidewalk. I stepped inside because sometimes a room invites you, and the least you can do is say hello. The owner looked up from a radio that only played stations from 3 towns over. He nodded with the slow confidence of a man who knows everyone eventually brings him the same kinds of objects for the same kinds of reasons. I did not need anything, and that is exactly why I stayed. I ran a hand over a row of watches with frozen faces, a pile of silver coins that had forgotten countries, a bowl of keys that no longer fit the doors they once promised to open. The owner asked if I was looking for time or luck. I said I was just taking inventory. He smiled like someone who has seen worse inventories. He pushed a small wooden box toward me and said customers leave these and forget them. The box held a stack of tarot cards with edges soft from being handled. I do not read cards and the cards do not read me, and yet one card had slipped free and faced up. It showed a figure who held a cup and watched another cup spill into a dark stream. The picture carried less drama than you would expect and more calm. The calm settled on me like a coat that fit. I thanked the man and left the box where it was. He shrugged as if to say the story will find its own way. I walked back to the office with the sense that the day had quietly tilted, and that the tilt did not ask my permission. I am fine with that because control is a myth people sell to each other like casseroles during a power outage. I would rather have matches than casseroles when the lights go out. That evening she texted that she would be late again. The words felt like a rerun. I set the pan on the stove and cooked anyway. The smell of rosemary climbed the stairs and turned the corner, and came back to me like a loyal dog. I ate my portion and put hers in the oven with the light on. The light made it look like a small stage, and the actress never arrived. When the clock passed 10, the oven light blinked. I know appliances do that, and I also know the blink happened 3 times with the exact interval my mother used when she knocked on my bedroom door to tell me something I did not want to hear. After the 3rd blink, the display flashed 8:08 and then corrected itself. I stood there with a fork and no appetite. I felt the house rearrange its furniture just a little to make room for an unseen guest. I slept poorly. It was not rage. It was not panic. It was something colder and cleaner, like the air in a hospital hallway. I dreamed a memory from childhood, where I stood in a cornfield at dusk and the stalks whispered in a language my father claimed he could understand. When I woke, there was a kernel on the nightstand. I know how that sounds. I also know it sat there pale and ordinary. I crushed it between thumb and forefinger. The shell gave and the smell that came up was sweet and summer and not from our pantry. I considered the possibility that the world enjoys a modest joke now and then. Saturday arrived like a referee who had slept on the couch. I decided I would not confront. I would verify. Those are different verbs, and a man should know his verbs. I started with the calendar on her laptop that sat on the desk we share. I did not break anything. I did not pry. I only looked at what was offered by the screen that woke when I brushed it with my knuckles. The calendar had color blocks that made a neat quilt, and the quilt had new pieces sewn in with titles that said client dinner and strategic session. These blocks did not exist 2 months ago, and my memory holds on to such patterns the way a field holds the shape of an old foundation long after the farmhouse has fallen. My phone buzzed with a notification from our phone plan that listed shared data use, and the peaks matched the nights with the new blocks. None of that is a crime. All of that is a contour map. I see mountains when I look at contour maps, and I pack a jacket accordingly. In the afternoon I drove by her office because a man is allowed to understand the geography of his own life. I parked across the street with a coffee that went cool before I noticed. I watched people leave in pairs and singles and in the long thinning line that means the day is over. She did not appear. The reflection in the lobby glass showed a woman who could have been her and was not. The security guard flipped a sign from open to closed. The streetlights tested themselves one by one like students in a roll call. I sat there until the feeling in my legs announced itself. I drove home by a different route and crossed a bridge I usually avoid. A heron stood in the shallows like a monk, and the water below moved with the slow confidence of older things. That night she came home with the careful energy of someone managing variables. She set her bag down and looked tired the way a person looks when they have spent energy on a story. I asked how the dinner went. She said productive. She took a shower with the door closed. When she stepped out, the steam carried a scent that did not match our soap. I told a small joke about the company picking up the tab. She smiled with only the top half of her face and went to bed early. I stayed in the kitchen with the coin and the oven clock and the rosemary. I listened to the building breathe, and I understood that knowing is a slow river that still gets you there if you sit still in the boat. Toward midnight, an old sound surfaced from the basement. Came from the pipes. It was the thin metal song I have heard 100 times during winter. The song carried a new note like a low bell, and the bell rang 3 times. I felt an answer rise in me that did not ask for proof. I walked down the stairs and stood on the concrete. I waited for the bell to speak again, and it did not, and that was fine. I went back up and poured the last of the coffee. I stared at the coin which had rolled to the lip of the drawer and stopped as if listening. I told it that I heard the message and I would not rush the translation. Patience is the tool that does not dull if you handle it right. When I finally lay beside her, the space between us felt like a field after harvest. The stubble poked through the frost and the air smelled thin. I watched the ceiling and thought about the pawn shop, the card with the cups, the heron on the river. I understood I had entered a different season of my life. Seasons do not apologize for changing. In the dark, the numbers on the digital clock shifted through their quiet parade. As sleep came for me, they paused again on 8:08, as if to sign the ledger. I let them. I drifted off with an old calm that belonged to the boy in the cornfield, who learned to listen to stalks that whisper when the wind turns and the day empties and something in the world decides to speak without raising its voice. Sunday woke like a patient that has decided to get out of bed without asking. The light carried more purpose than the day before. I brewed coffee and let the steam mark the air like chalk lines on a driveway. I watched the mug warm my hands and told myself today I would move from suspicion to description. Suspicion eats its own tail. Description writes the ledger. Ledgers have a way of making decisions for you if you let them, and I have always respected a book that balances itself without drama. I set the coin on the counter and it stood again, and I nodded at it like two men who understand the same weather pattern without sharing a word. She stretched in the bedroom and called out that she would meet a friend for a morning class. She named a studio 3 blocks from the river and said there was a promotion for first-timers. I said take your time, and I meant it. When the door closed the house side, I finished my coffee and told myself a walk could not hurt. A man is allowed to check the tides of his own shoreline. The coin rolled in a slow circle and stopped with its head toward the front door. I smiled at the theatrics and slipped it into my pocket, because sometimes you take the omen along like a snack that may or may not be necessary. The studio occupies a brick building that used to be a machine shop. The old sign still hangs behind the new one. The street held the soft foot traffic of people trying to become better by moving their bodies into shapes with names. I stood across the way near a bakery that had not yet opened. The glass reflected a sky that could not decide between blue and steel. The number over the door of the studio read 808. I felt a small shrug in my chest, like a polite cough in church. I told the world I had noticed and that noticing would suffice. She did not appear at the door. 15 minutes passed. Strangers arrived and padded inside with rolled mats and determined faces. A car pulled into a slot 2 doors down. I knew the car without having ever seen it, because knowledge has a scent, and the scent matched the cedar I had tasted in our shower steam. The man from the restaurant lot stepped out. His posture still asked for agreement. He waited without looking at the studio. She came around the corner from the opposite direction with a speed that belonged to a secret that believes it is safe. They met by the doorway of a co-working loft beside the studio. The loft sign carried a name that tried too hard. I watched them enter the building that was not the studio. The front desk worker pretended not to know them and pretended to know them at the same time. That is a talent some people cultivate for tips and survival. I did not follow. Doors open for a reason, and a reason is not the same as an invitation. I stood there with the bakery sign in my peripheral. A delivery truck hissed and the operator waved me around the bumper as if we had known each other for years. I moved and saw a row of mailboxes for the loft tenants. My eyes landed on a label that paired his last name with a suite number. The number wore the same thin grin as the studio. I felt the neat little click that happens when a padlock meets the right key. I told the universe the joke was funny and we could keep it short. I walked the river to clear the adrenaline that had arrived without my consent. The water pulled its slow rope south. A barge moved with an old patience. A heron rode the current in the shadow of the bridge. A small wind slid across my face and smelled like cold iron and rosemary and memory. I understood that memory is the only spice you cannot control. I let it do what it wanted and made room for it the way you make room for a guest with an inconvenient suitcase because you owe them from a long time ago. By noon I was home. The coin leaped from my pocket when I sat. It balanced on the edge of the table for a long breath and then fell, clinking and spinning toward the hall like a child let loose at recess. It stopped at the threshold to the bedroom as if the floor had a seam there. I watched it without touching it and felt the air hold something like backstage silence before a curtain lifts. My phone vibrated with a payment alert that listed a charge from a kitchen store across town. My name was not on the loyalty account. I opened the receipt out of habit. The code at the bottom ended with 808. I laughed because you have to laugh when a theme commits to its role with that level of enthusiasm. In the afternoon I called an old friend who once ran a diner that taught me more about people than college. I asked for general wisdom without details. He said truths do not mind daylight, plans do not mind delays, and if you cook tomatoes low and slow with a little sugar they will forgive almost anything. I thanked him for the trifecta and hung up. I took a pot from the rack because some advice should be honored even if only for the smell. The sauce worked its quiet therapy on the house. The radiator ticked in reply. I felt less like a detective and more like a steward of facts, and stewardship suits me better than disguise anyway. She came home in the late afternoon with a bag from the grocery and a comb that had been polished. I asked about the class and she said good. I said I made sauce and she said that sounded perfect. We moved through the kitchen like people who know the steps to an old dance that still saves ankles. I watched her place the bag on the counter. The receipt peeked out. I saw a small stamp from a coffee shop near the loft. I said nothing because silence is a tool and you should not misuse your tools. We ate with care. The food did its best. Afterward she said she would meet a friend for an evening walk. I said I might read. She kissed my temple with a tenderness that belonged somewhere and not here. I recognized generosity when I felt it. Generosity can be borrowed, can also be stolen. I let an hour pass and then left the house with a book I did not plan to open. I drove to the co-working building because I prefer knowing to guessing. The lobby lamp cast a mellow circle. The door stood unlocked because Sunday brings lazy security. I stepped inside and read the directory. His name matched the mailbox and the company line offered a bland promise. I walked back out without going up because a boundary still has value even when the fence is low. As I reached the sidewalk, the elevator dinged. They stepped into the lobby with matching smiles that faded as soon as they parted to opposite doors. He went left and she went right. She saw me, and in that instant I saw her understand the math. I saw her not run the equation because she wanted a moment before the numbers arrived. I said I was out for a walk. She said she had been working. The sentence floated between us like a small raft neither of us had built well. I let it float because rescue operations take training, and I did not have a permit. I asked if she wanted to get coffee. She said she was tired and needed a shower. I nodded. We walked to the car together with the silence of two people who have both misplaced the same thing and cannot agree on when it happened. We drove home without the radio because music would have tried too hard. The house welcomed us like a dog that has decided to love both owners, even if one of them keeps arriving later than agreed. That night the power blinked 3 times at 8:08. I know because I was watching the clock due to a book that refused to hold my focus. The blinks lined up with the slow bell in the pipes from the other night. The coin in the hall leaned against the baseboard like a tired soldier. The oven light turned itself on for a breath and off again. The refrigerator sighed an old tired sigh. I stood in the middle of the kitchen and felt the way you feel in a train that has just switched tracks without slowing. The motion remains the same. The direction only reveals itself once the next town arrives. I did not confront. I have learned that unveiling can be more precise than attack. A clean cut heals. A ragged tear does not. I chose to mark the line instead. I cleaned the table and stacked the evidence in my mind not as weapons but as ledgers. I told myself the reveal would happen at the right hour, and that hours sometimes come dressed as numbers that repeat like courteous messengers. I set the coin on the mantel where it could see the room. I turned off the kitchen light and looked back. The glass of water on the counter held the reflection of the oven clock. The digits made their quiet little figure. I nodded and went to bed with the strange calm that follows a good inventory, and the faint smell of rosemary still floating in the stairwell like a witness who intends to testify when called, and not before. Monday took its clipboard and made its rounds. I let it because structure keeps a man from pacing holes in his own floor. I moved through the day with ordinary efficiency. I felt the quiet ache that lives under the ribs like a tenant who has paid through the end of the month, and I accepted its lease for now. I watched for the pattern as a fisherman watches a river that he knows will rise an inch at dusk. Again I saw the numbers. Again I felt the nudge. I told the world I was not ignoring it and that acknowledgement would have to do until the end of the week, when I intended to set the stage and turn on the house lights, to see who took a seat in the front row and who chose the exit instead. I chose Friday because Friday is when people tell the truth by accident. I wanted an honest accident more than a forced confession. I sent her a message that suggested dinner at home with actual time and actual food. I kept it simple. She replied that work would be heavy and I nodded, because nodding moves the neck and keeps the blood from pooling in a bad place. I started my list the way a carpenter lays out a cut. I did not put revenge on the list. I did not put spectacle on the list. I wrote clarity and I wrote calm. I underlined calm 3 times in my head, because a steady hand makes a cleaner line. On Tuesday I stopped by the pawn shop, because some rooms deliver what you need when you stop insisting on a particular brand. The bell over the door hung from a wire that had been bent too many times. The owner looked up from his radio that still chased signals from 3 towns away. I nodded and he nodded, and words were not required. He reached under the counter and placed a mantel clock on the glass. It was the kind that once stood in living rooms where daylight fades slow across a family picture. It was not wound, and its hands pointed at a familiar arrangement. I did not need him to say anything to understand that the clock had made up its mind. I paid him cash and he wrote the price on a receipt as if recording a weather report. I carried the clock home with the careful grip you use on old things that might hold one last trick. That evening I set the clock on the mantel across from the kitchen table. I did not wind it. I went about the business of reheating leftovers, choosing a plate without a fissure, letting the oven light make theater of simple food. When the wall clock above the stove clicked to its small threshold, the mantel clock ticked once. I am telling you I heard it. The sound was not loud, but it was final. The pipes in the basement answered with that low bell that has begun to announce itself in my house, as if the house has decided to hum along with the key the day prefers. I touched the wood of the mantel and it felt warmer than the room. I told the space that we had a plan, and that I would stick to the plan. Wednesday I reserved a small conference room in the co-working building. because a man can rent a neutral ground for a modest fee. The person at the desk wrote my first name in block letters next to the hour and the suite number. The suite number wore that same thin grin that the studio had worn. I did not bother asking for a different room because at some point you stop arguing with the floor plan and let the floor plan have its joke. I sent an email to the Bland Company account that lived beside his name on the directory. I used my own name and my own number. I requested a short meeting about a service he claimed to offer. I chose the time that matched the numbers that had been walking beside me, and I chose it without drama. Then I left the building, walked the block, and let the river air untie a small knot in my shoulder. Thursday, I stocked the kitchen with small honest items that make a table say sit and talk without raising its voice. I bought rosemary because tradition matters. I bought bread because a man should have bread on a night when a topic refuses to stay small. I laid a white cloth in the back seat and folded it twice, like a flag for a country that no longer exists. I told myself I would carry it if the night asked me to carry it, and I would leave it in the trunk if the night decided to take place elsewhere. I sharpened the knife that had dulled on cautious dinners. I felt the old ease of a tool finding its edge again. I remembered the advice to cook tomatoes low and slow with a little sugar, and I let a pot murmur on the back burner while the house breathed and the mantel clock kept its silent posture. The morning of Friday arrived with a plain face, and that was a kindness. I made coffee and held the mug with both hands. I thought about fairness. Fairness is a scale that people like to pretend is level while they lean on it with a hip. I told myself I would not step on the scale. I would place the weights, I would watch, I would record. I pulled the coin from the mantel and set it on its edge on the kitchen table. It held for the length of a breath, and then it leaned toward the door again. I pocketed it because we have been traveling together and I do not like to leave partners behind even when they pick the playlist. At dusk, I loaded the white cloth, 2 plates, and 2 glasses into a small bag. I drove to the co-working building. The lobby light held that mellow circle. The elevator gave its little theater chime. I stepped into the rented room and set the cloth on the small table, placed the plates and the glasses. I stood the coin on edge between them. It held the way a memory sometimes holds, even when you would bet money that it should have fallen by now. I set a sprig of rosemary across the center like a quiet truth. I sat in the single chair that faced the door. I let the room settle, and rooms settle if you give them the courtesy of a minute without movement. The door opened at the hour I had chosen. He stepped in with a confident half-smile that expected deference. He carried a folder that had never done any real work. He froze when he saw the table. He looked around for a camera, because men who live on staged admiration fear unplanned audiences more than consequences. Then she arrived. The look that crossed her face moved from recognition to arithmetic to weather report and finally to the tired acceptance of a farmer who looks at a broken fence and understands the animals will not come back on their own. I stayed in my chair. I let the silence explain the event. Silence is a professional when you give it a decent room and a clear stage. I did not raise my voice. I did not list receipts on the table, because paper drama feeds the wrong appetite. I told them what I knew, the way a mechanic tells a driver that the belt has frayed and the engine will stop on its terms if you do not stop it on yours. I watched their eyes as people do when they want to believe they can rearrange facts by rearranging how they occupy their sockets. I said the numbers had done their steady work. Repetition is a language, and I am finally fluent. I slid the coin to her side. It spun and stood, and for a heartbeat all 3 of us watched a very small round object perform a trick that refused to be a trick. In that heartbeat, I saw her remember a house that smelled like rosemary. I saw him remember an office that smelled like cedar. I felt the night reach the first landing of the stair. He tried a speech in the polished tone of a man who has not often been asked to carry his share of the doubt. He ran out of runway because the room had no air for speeches. She tried a softer thing that asked me to be the person I have usually been. I let the asks circle the ceiling and find no perch. I said I was not here to prosecute and I was not here to forgive. I was here to mark the change of season, and the change had already happened. I would not be walking backward into summer, because autumn has its own harvest and I can live on that just fine. The mantel clock at home may have ticked again at that moment, and I will never know, And that is fine because houses keep their own calendars beyond human reach, and they are not obliged to share. I stood and gathered the cloth, the plates, the glasses. I left the rosemary where it lay, because the room could use a little honesty after we left. I told her she could come home or not. If she came home, we would sit at the table and revise the blueprint of our days with clean lines and no nostalgia. If she did not, then I would eat the food I had prepared, and I would sleep the whole night through for the first time in months. I would wake to a kitchen that had only one plate in the sink, and a clock that would still show me its small private joke when it wanted. I walked out before anyone could invent an ending that did not belong to us. The night air felt like a sheet pulled free from a clothesline. I carried the bag. The coin in my pocket felt light. The elevator doors closed with the small sigh of a book shutting on a chapter that has finally decided it has said enough. The lobby light looked no different. The street did not celebrate. The river kept pulling its rope south. A heron ghosted past the bridge as if moving between stories. I drove home on the quiet route that avoids the busy lights. I parked and went inside. I set the cloth on the table. I set one plate. I warmed the sauce. I ate slowly because food deserves time. When I looked up, the oven display made its little shape. I laughed once without sound. I understood that the house had chosen me as a witness and also as a participant, and that both jobs were mine for now until the story reached its honest end, which as I have learned is rarely the same as the dramatic one. I woke before the light. The house held the same careful hush as a library that knows a patron will soon return a book that has been overdue for too long. I moved through the rooms and put water on. The kettle breathed. The mantel clock sat still as a cat on a windowsill. The coin slept on the table. I let everything stay as it was while I ate toast without appetite, because the body needs simple fuel when the day plans to ask hard things. As the first thin gray turned to uncomplicated morning, the door opened and she stepped in with the posture of someone who has walked a mile carrying a full glass and has not spilled a drop. She said she needed a shower. I nodded and said towels are on the chair. She passed down the hall with that small reserve that arrives when two people know the ledger has stopped counting favors. She came back dressed quiet and sat at the table. We let the seconds stack without trying to push them around. She said she would stay in the guest room for now. I said the guest room is a room like any other. She said she would make calls later. I said start with the ones that matter. We did not circle words like forgiveness or closure, because those are big round balloons that children enjoy and adults stick with pins when nobody is looking. She went to lie down and the house exhaled. I carried my mug to the sink and saw a line of moisture on the window that had drawn the outline of a number I did not wish to name. I wiped it with the back of my hand and it came back lighter. I let it stay because not everything needs to be erased to be understood. At 8 minutes past 8, the mantel clock that I had not wound ticked once, as if to sign attendance. The pipes under the floor replied with a low bell that I felt more than heard. The coin rolled of its own accord toward the basement door and leaned against it like a polite petitioner. I laughed without sound, because a man can appreciate choreography even when the dance is not the one he would have picked. I opened the door. The cool air lifted. I walked down the steps, counting in my head the way you count when you are not sure whether you want to reach the end. Halfway down, I smelled something that did not belong to basements. It was rosemary. It was faint and old, and it hovered near the furnace, where heat and dust tell each other stories that no one else hears. Behind the furnace, a space opened the way spaces do when a contractor decides to save $1 on framing. In that space sat a shoebox that had not been there before, because I know this basement and I know the way it holds its junk like a museum of harmless failures. The box wore the lid of a brand we do not buy. I lifted it and the lid came free. Inside lay receipts and ticket stubs, the small ticket of a coat check from a bar near the river, a key on a ring with a disc stamped with the number 808. A folded paper had the address of a storage facility printed neat along the top. The name on the rental agreement belonged to her, but it used her middle name as a last name and her old office as a mailing point. My stomach did that polite drop that happens when an elevator stops half a floor before it reaches the level you asked for. I held the key. Its weight told me the day had decided to get specific. I put the lid back and left the box exactly as I had found it, because evidence and explanation are not always the same thing. I prefer the latter when possible. I walked upstairs. She stood in the hall with damp hair and eyes that had done arithmetic and come to a table where the numbers do not fight anymore. I held up the key and asked whether we should make the drive together. She said, "Give me a minute for shoes." The minute stretched long and then it came back with a breath. We left without locking the door because trust had already left, and locks work for friends and delivery drivers more than they work for the weather that lives inside people. The storage facility sat behind a tire shop and a chain link fence. The clerk wore a name tag that said nothing to either of us. He waved us through with the laziness of a man who expects nothing important to occur before lunch. We found the row and the unit with the number that had been following me like a dog with its own idea about destiny. I slid the key into the lock and turned. The door rolled up with that corrugated groan that always sounds like a field note from a rust orchestra. The smell that came out was fabric and cedar and something else I recognized only after a second. That something else was our kitchen from 2 years ago. That is an odd sentence, and I will not apologize for it, because truth is not obliged to make sense to a stranger. Inside the unit sat a small table that looked like our table before we sanded the edge last spring. It held 2 plates that matched a pattern we had tossed after a chip, 2 glasses that did not match any set we kept. A sprig of dried rosemary in a jar, as if taste can be archived like a photograph. A skillet, same brand as ours. A stack of napkins folded too precisely to be accidental. A blanket we had given to donation months ago, and it had come here instead. On a shelf, a row of notebooks sat like uniformed witnesses. One was open to a page where she had written a list that began with "learn his sauces" and ended with "call him by the nickname he hates only when he is already smiling." I did not feel rage. I did not feel vindication. What I felt was the plain calm of a librarian discovering a misfiled book whose absence had been making the catalog lie, and now the catalog could tell the truth again. There were photos in a shallow box. I saw my own face in some and a careful crop in others where the corner of my shoulder had been cut away to make a new frame. Movie stubs matched dates on our calendar marked as solo gym nights. A cheap fountain pen I had lost 2 winters ago lay there. It wrote like a dream until it did not. I held it and the last of its ink drew a small line on my thumb. That line looked like the river under the bridge where the heron had stood. I realized that what hurt did not come from romance or even betrayal, but from the administrative competence of the whole thing. Someone had kept 2 lives with better filing than I had used for one. Inventory is my religion, and I do not like to find a rival church with better pews. She stood beside me without touching anything. Her breathing carried the rhythm of a person who has decided to stop rehearsing. I asked how long. She told me a number that I will not write, because this story does not need it. She said it began with friendship, as such things always do when 2 adults grocery shop for their missing parts. It grew into a second set of rooms where she could try on a version of herself that had once lived close to the surface and had sunk during the years when money turned into bills and time turned into lists. I heard that and did not argue with the psychology because I am not a judge and I am not a therapist. I am the man who makes dinner. I am the man who keeps ledgers. I am the man who woke up when the house started talking. I reached for a small tin under the table. It held matches. I struck one and touched it to the sprig in the jar. A thin thread of smoke rose and then gave up. The scent unfurled. I said, "This is the last time our house will smell like rosemary for your version of us." She nodded. Her face softened in that tired way people own when they understand the bill will be paid today and not tomorrow. I pinched the ember and put the cold sprig back, because I do not want a fire that belongs to anybody but me. I turned and we stepped out. I pulled the door down, locked it, handed her the key. She did not take it. I put it into my pocket with the coin. The 2 circles clicked against each other like friendly bugs. We drove without radio. The air between us was clear and thin, like mountain weather that will not pretend to be warm just to be liked. When we reached the house, she went to the guest room. I went to the kitchen, set the skillet on the stove, let it heat while I cleaned the cutting board and sharpened the knife. I worked slow and careful. I made a small dinner for one, because a man should prove to his own hands that they can still perform the pattern without applause. I ate at the table and left the second plate in the cabinet. I washed up, dried up, put everything in its place. The mantel clock ticked once at the usual minute. The pipes hummed. The refrigerator offered its tired sigh. The house felt like a companion more than a location. That was new and strange and acceptable. She joined me after an hour with a stack of envelopes that held insurance, utilities, the dull paperwork of survival. We placed them side by side and made quiet decisions that were not heroic and were not tragic. They were only choices that adults make when they have exhausted their supply of pretend. The coin sat on the corner and watched our hands move. Every time I looked up, the oven clock rested its lit bars into that little shape. I stopped flinching at it, because the number had become a neighbor with whom I had settled a dispute and who now only waved from the porch. Night slipped in. She went back to the guest room. I stood in the hall and listened to two different silences. Mine felt honest. Hers felt heavy. I could not carry hers, and I chose not to resent that. I walked to the living room, lifted the mantel clock, set it on the table, placed the coin beside it. I leaned back and closed my eyes. A picture rose from the floor of my memory like a paper boat launched by a bored child. It was the cornfield from my boyhood. The stalk spoke, and I understood exactly nothing and exactly enough. When I opened my eyes, the clock pointed its hands to a time that did not match the stove, and it did not match any clock in any catalog. Still, I trusted it because the hand that draws a line does not always need a ruler to know it is straight. I slept on the couch and woke before dawn. The air tasted like the first day of school. I folded the blanket and made coffee. I set one mug on the counter for habit, then returned it to the cabinet for accuracy. I turned the calendar to a clean page and wrote only one line. The line said, "Revise the blueprint and sign it in the kitchen." I underlined "sign it" with the same patient weight a carpenter uses when he checks a beam that will hold a roof through winter. I stood in the quiet and felt the house lean with me in agreement. I understood that the end would need a small ceremony, and that the ceremony should be mine to design. The hour for it had already been chosen by an arithmetic that does not consult human pride. I was fine with that because pride is noisy, and endings should be quiet and precise. Old honest tools should be involved, and maybe a sprig of rosemary for the witness who knows how we got here and will not interrupt when we decide how to leave. I chose the hour because the hour had chosen me. I set the kitchen the way a stagehand sets a familiar play. I placed one plate and one glass and one sprig of rosemary, cut from the plant on the sill that had kept growing through months that did not deserve its patience. I set the coin on its edge on the table. I brought the mantel clock from the living room and set it where it could watch. I wrote on a clean sheet of paper the words "Revise the blueprint and sign it in the kitchen." Then I waited without pacing and without bravado, because some work requires a steady chair and a plain spine. She came from the guest room with a shoebox of photographs and a small stack of folded shirts. She placed the box by the door and stood with her hands at her sides. I nodded toward the chair and she sat. I pushed the paper across the table. We read quietly because loud reading belongs to classrooms and this was not a lesson. The plan said, "You keep what you built before me, I keep what I built before you, we split what we built together, we return what we borrowed from each other, and we do not take more time than we need." She took the pen and wrote her name with care and handed it back. I wrote mine. I felt the house settle around the line where the ink dried. At 8 minutes after 8, the mantel clock ticked once, though I had never wound it. The pipes answered with the low bell that bound this whole strange season into one braid. The oven light flicked as if someone had passed a hand in front of it. The coin stood straighter and did not fall. We both looked at it and then looked away, because a trick becomes a ritual only when you stop flinching and accept the cue. I lifted my glass and did not make a toast, because words have weight and I did not want to bruise the air. We drank and set the glasses down. The sound they made was small and decent. We packed without hurry and without delay. The guest room lost its last few secrets. The bathroom gave back a couple of bottles that had never belonged to our shelf. The hall closet surrendered a jacket with a cuff that had learned a new perfume. We did not build a scene out of these details because scenes are gossip and we were busy with facts. I carried 2 boxes to her car. She carried 2 more. The street had that mild face a city wears when it knows 2 people are drawing a new border and does not wish to interfere. A neighbor lifted a hand and then put it down, as if the air had changed its mind about being social. That was fine because we had work left. We drove to the storage facility and returned the key. The clerk said nothing. The door to the unit rolled up and the air inside felt embarrassed. I stacked the notebooks into a tote. She took the jar with the dead rosemary sprig. She held it for a long breath and then set it down on the floor as if setting down a tired story. I folded the blanket and placed it on a pile that would go to donation. I laid a hand on the small table that pretended to be ours and felt nothing. I liked feeling nothing there, because it meant the room at home could breathe again without a borrowed lung. We rolled the door down. The lock clicked. The sound was not dramatic, and that was the mercy of it. On the way back we crossed the river. The heron stood on a shoal like a character in a book who knows his 2 lines by heart and speaks them at the right page. I caught his outline in the mirror and felt that small shrug from the world that says pay attention and then get on with it. We drove the rest in silence that had weight and not menace. When we reached the house she parked and said she would take the car to her sister, and that she would send an address and that she would let the mail know. I said all right, and I meant it in the modest way that word can mean everything that needs to be said. She gathered the last bag and stood in the doorway. We looked at each other without a frame. I reached for the pen and wrote one more line under the plan. The line said no more pretend. She nodded, because she had always been good at reading when the letters were plain. She stepped onto the porch and the afternoon kept its voice down. The door closed behind her with a sound I had heard 1,000 times and had never really listened to. I stood there with my hand on the knob for one long breath. Then I let the breath go and the knob cooled under my palm. The kitchen filled with a light that made the counters look new without changing a thing. I carried the mantel clock back to its place and for the first time I wound it. The spring took the turn with a smooth forgiveness I did not expect. The second hand began its small honest march. The room answered like a choir of ordinary appliances willing to sing backing vocals now that the soloist had left. I set the coin in the center of the table and tapped it once. This time it did not stand and it did not spin. It lay flat like a period at the end of a sentence that had used too many words and maybe needed all of them. I smiled because sometimes closure is only that a circle decides to lie down. I cooked because that is what I do when the day requests an ending and a beginning at the same hour. I set the skillet on the heat and sliced garlic and tore the rosemary with my fingers. I let the oil take both with a quiet hiss that sounded like relief. I boiled water and salted it like the sea. I chose a plate without a chip because the meal did not need a metaphor. When the sauce came together low and slow with a little sugar, I thought about the diner advice and the truth of tomatoes. I twirled the pasta and let it sit a minute with the flame off. Then I carried it to the table and sat with my shoulders down and ate as if the food had asked me to be present. And I said yes. The oven clock made its little shape again, and I did not mind. I raised the fork in a salute to all the hours that had dragged me here, to all the quiet warnings the house had offered, to all the humble witnesses that had done their jobs without pay. I thought of the pawn shop and the man with the radio that chased stations from towns I will not visit. I thought of the cornfield and the whispering stalks and the boy who learned to listen. I understood that the uncanny had not arrived to perform magic but to teach measurement, to show me where the load-bearing walls had cracked and where to place the beam that would hold the next roof without groaning. After dinner I washed the plate and dried it and placed it in the cabinet. I wiped the table with the patience of a caretaker who has decided to stay. The mantel clock said it was time for a walk, and yes, I know I am making that up, and also I went. The street felt new without changing its asphalt. The river wore the color of steel. The heron had moved down shore. The air carried a clean bite that would be winter soon. I thought about safety and how I had once confused it with routine. How routine can hide a hole. How safety is a thing you build with attention, repair with honesty. How a kitchen can serve as a workshop where you draft the plans and sign them, and then eat the blueprint to keep it in your bones. I came home and turned off the lights room by room, leaving the oven light on because the small stage still pleases me. I set the coin back in the drawer where it can do its party trick for someone else on a day that requires a nudge. I put the pen away and slid the signed plan under the flour jar, because the kitchen is where contracts should live. I stood in the doorway and listened. The house answered with the quiet breath of a place that has decided to keep me. I thanked it in the only way a man can thank a building, by taking out the trash, locking the door, and making sure the sink is clean before he goes to sleep. When the clock reached the hour again, it ticked with a sound that did not ask for interpretation. I lay down and closed my eyes and saw the parking lot in the rain and the bouquet in the puddle and the 2 empty plates. In the same frame, I saw the table tonight with 1 clean plate, the smell of garlic and rosemary, a ledger that balanced. I knew the connection was tidy and not tidy at the same time. I accepted both because the world is allowed 2 registers, and so am I. I slept with the calm that belongs to men who have stopped waiting on someone else to decide where the door is and which key fits. I used to believe marriage was simple and that dinner could guard a house. Now I believe dinners tell the truth. Houses whisper when you forget to listen. Numbers will follow you until you answer them. A man can write his own blueprint on a kitchen table and sign it with a steady hand and light the burner and eat while the food is hot. That is enough for tonight and maybe for a while longer. The smell of rosemary moved up the stairs like a witness who has finally testified and gone home. The silence that followed did not accuse and did not conceal. Felt safe because it was mine.